come to the main part of the evening. And I'm very, very pleased to invite Maria. And I'm going to give Maria a wave. This is the first time she's been on for the Many Mondays. And I asked her to send me a little bit of a CV. And I'm going to praise you that CV that she sent me, and said that she's worked in finance for 16 years. And in June last year, through circumstances, she decided to look at some different career options, but got sidetracked because she began to find out quite a bit about climate control, about diversity, and the massive the massive inequalities that not only exist in poorer countries, but are right here in the UK. She actually joined the newly formed West Cheshire Green New Deal, and of course met Anne and a few other people who were on the call this evening, and actually volunteered and said to Anne that she'd like to do a talk on For the Many Mondays. And her talk this evening is going to be about GDP and Doughnut Economics. Now, Maria is no expert. She's no expert at this, she readily admits it, but she's looked into it. She wants to present it to us. And she said that she'd be prepared to answer some questions as best she possibly can afterwards, and we could have a discussion. And as I said to Maria, I'm always very happy to welcome someone new to For the Many Mondays, someone who is not used to speaking probably and giving presentations, who want to give it a go. So please be, friendly towards Maria, all right? No expert, but let's have a listen to what she's got to say, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting. Maria, over to you. And if it can be recorded now, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much indeed. Maria, it's all yours. You'll have to unmute yourself first.
Yep, I'll share my screen first. Oh, screen sharing's been disabled.
That's it, brilliant.
Can you see that in presentation mode?
Yes.
No, we can't. We've got the other screen, Maria. That's it. Yep, we can see your first slide now.
Right, I'll start now. I'm here today to share what I've been learning about GDP, prosperity and doughnut economics. As David's already said, I'm not an academic. I haven't done a presentation for 25 years. So getting to grips with PowerPoint has been challenging. So yeah, go easy on me. If you'd have told me 12 months ago that I would be sat here presenting on this topic, I would have thought you were mad. I had no understanding of GDP, thought prosperity only related to how financially well off you were, and the only donut I would have been interested in was a jam donut. But the last 12 months haven't been ordinary for any of us. And for me, the realisation that I've been disconnected from many of the things that really matter came as a shock. I lost my job, working in accounts. So I used this opportunity to take a step back. And what I found in the world, I found actually pretty frightening. The pandemic has made many of us realise that our time on earth is precious, and issues that were previously overlooked are suddenly more important than ever before. We're reflecting more on our impact on the planet and understanding that, that resources are not infinite. During this time, the divide between rich and poor has grown further. Those on low incomes who have suffered job losses now have the additional challenge of homeschooling and feeding a family at home all day long. Food banks have therefore seen an increased demand, and it has fallen to communities to provide laptops and other resources as well to those in need. In contrast to this, Amazon has had an increase in net profit of 84%, and CEO Jeff Bezos added $13 million to his wealth in one day. Is this there? Scientists found that ethnic minorities were more likely to die of COVID, and this year saw protests ignited around the world demanding racial justice after the death of George Floyd. Our society became one with polarised views, where Black Lives Matter was contested with All Lives Matter. People grappled with conversations about colonialism, white privilege, institutional and systemic racism. As the world came to a stop, nature came into its own. The air around us became cleaner, wildlife returned to cities, and for the most, life slowed down. Our use of fossil fuels has increased the temperature of the atmosphere, causing melting of the ice caps and increased sea levels. If we can't keep within a 1.5 degree increase, the devastation will be immense. So I've learned a lot in the last 12 months about the problems our planet is facing, but it isn't all doom and gloom. I hope this presentation educates and highlights how we can tackle these issues without putting additional pressure on the planet's resources. So I'm going to look at GDP. We're going to look at GDP and how the continuous striving for growth has contributed to the climate and ecological crisis. But this is not only an environmental issue, but also an economic, racial and social justice issue. And we'll look at prosperity, what we should be measuring in addition to GDP, and finally, Doughnut Economics, how a new way of thinking about economics could change the trajectory of the climate catastrophe and the societal breakdown that's been predicted by scientists. So this diagram is Rostow's stages of economic growth. He describes 5 distinct phases that countries pass through in the process of economic development. He compares the stages with that of a flight. The first phase, traditional society, would be the grounded plane, and is based on early society where output wasn't traded or recorded and barter would have been very common. The next stage, preconditions for takeoff, is based on infrastructure so that development can take place. So for example, transport network and supplies. The takeoff stage relates to the Industrial Revolution. So in the years approximately 1760 to 1840 in the UK, with the introduction of manufacturing industries, improved infrastructure, and that's basically when culture massively started to change. The next stage, drive to maturity, becomes self-sustaining. Wealth generation enables further investment in value-added industry and development. Industry becomes more diversified and increased levels of technology are utilised. The final stage, high mass consumption, probably started around the 1930s to 40s in the UK. And in this phase, people generally have more wealth and buy more goods and services. But there's a few things that we should consider when looking at this. Firstly, although many countries are at the stage of high mass consumption, there are many poorer countries that haven't yet made it past the takeoff stage. Secondly, the wealth and infrastructure of Britain and many other European countries is due to colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. Our railways, bridges, town halls, canals, libraries, churches were all built on the back of slavery. The government only finished paying slave owners in 2015 for the freedom of slaves. So for whilst many people see this as historic racism, for Black people, it still feels very recent. Thirdly, high consumption assumes an infinite number of resources. But as we are more and more aware, the earth is finite and the rate resources are being used is not sustainable and puts many species on earth, including humans, at risk of extinction. GDP measures were developed in this high mass consumption era as a way to value goods and services produced in the UK and estimate the size and growth of the economy. The reasons for its development during the Depression and the Second World War are not relevant to today's economy. The 21st century needs a wider range of measures than the 20th century. And in the Doughnut Economics book, Kate Raworth says that we should be agnostic or indifferent about GDP growth. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But finally, and this is another very good point, Rostow's diagram suggests never-ending growth. But a plane can't stay in the air forever. At some point, it must land or arrive at its destination. And Catherine Trebeck and Jeremy Williams discussed this in their book, The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. What does mature economics look like? So before we answer this question, we need to look at a little bit at GDP closer. So what does it tell us? And more importantly, what doesn't it tell us? So governments always aim for GDP growth as it relates to the wealth or the prosperity of the country. Weak or negative growth in real GDP output that lasts at least 2 quarters is classed as a recession. And if it turns into a year or more, it becomes a depression. So obviously governments want to avoid this, but the GPD measure doesn't take into consideration the following. Current levels of consumerism and carbon emissions in richer countries, such as ours, are unsustainable for the environment. In a broadcast that I watched recently, George Monbiot said that if all countries in the world achieved 3% growth each year, continuing at current practices in the world, we would be stripped of all its resources within 24 years. Now that's a sobering thought. This is due to our high fossil fuel lifestyles. So whether that's lots of flight for work, holidays, our personal cars, commercial vehicle transport. And at the same time as this, the earth is being stripped of other resources to feed our addictions to mobile phones, laptops, computers, and our high meat diets. Land use that has been changed to produce crops for feeding cattle has devastating impacts on biodiversity and climate change. And all these materials are finite. It also doesn't take into account that Britain's increase in GDP, consumerism and high consumption lifestyles has consequences for other countries. And to make this point, I want you to look at these maps. So this first map shows the CO2 emissions per capita. The redder areas are the ones being the higher emission countries like USA, Australia and China. The greener areas are those countries that emit the least, Africa, South America and parts of Asia. The next slide shows how vulnerable countries are to climate change. So those in the yellow to red are those most vulnerable, and the green being the least. If you put those two side by side, they're almost mirror images. So what you can see is that those that contribute the least to climate change are and will be affected more. And these countries are Africa, Asia, South America. This makes it a racial justice issue. Our country's wealth was created on the back of slavery, and now our wealthy lifestyle is damaging those countries as they are already suffering the effects of climate change. Wealthier countries also have the resources, insurance and infrastructure to bounce back after flooding, drought, storms and other weather patterns caused by climate change. Those more vulnerable countries, they haven't got those. GDP growth doesn't necessarily mean improved living standards for all. And depending on government policies, there may actually be a lower living standard for many people. I like this quote. It's time to recognise that the richest countries have already arrived in the world long hoped for. There are more than enough material and monetary resources, yet most economies do not operate in a way that appreciates or shares them very well. The priority now is to make ourselves at home, a very different task from that of pursuing more and more without regard to quality or distribution. The divide between poor and rich has definitely grown with our current government. So GDP doesn't take into consideration non-financial aspects of prosperity. So I recently took part in a short course and the participants were asked what prosperity meant to them in one word. Here's some of the answers. What would yours be? And if you want to stick it in the chat, we could look at it later if there's enough time. So, as Kate Raworth says, here's the conundrum. No country has ever ended human deprivation without a growing economy, and no country has ever ended ecological degradation with one. So she goes on to say we need to be agnostic about growth. And by agnostic, she doesn't mean simply not caring about whether GDP growth is coming or not, nor does she mean refusing to measure when it's happening or not. She means in the sense of designing an economy that promotes human prosperity, whether GDP is going up, down, or holding steady. So because of the limitations and the danger of measuring a country solely based on GDP, alternative methods of measuring prosperity have been developed. And here's 3. And we'll put the links in the chat so you can have a better look at them if you want to. So the first, the Happy Planet Index. This ranks countries based on their ecological footprint, the well-being of the people, and the life expectancy of people. The second one, the Legatum Prosperity Index, measures economic quality, business environment, governance, education, health, safety and security, personal freedom, social capital, and the natural environment. This was created to show which policies can lift people out of poverty. And the last one, the Social Progress Index. This defines what it means to be a good society based on 3 dimensions: basic human needs, foundations of well-being and opportunity. It doesn't measure based on effort or intention, but on actual achievement. So, for example, instead of measuring what a country spends on healthcare, the length and quality of people's lives are measured instead. So these alternative methods should be playing a much more significant role in measuring the whole health of the economy. Oops. Right. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was launched in 2015 to end poverty and promote a healthy planet for all. So these are the 17 sustainable goals that were adopted in 2015, and they demand a transformation of financial, economic and political systems that govern our societies to guarantee the human rights of all. So these Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, have been agreed by all United Nations member states. The result of the Paris Agreement in 2015 was that 196 governments agreed to work to keep the world's average temperature well below rising to 2 degrees above what had been before the Industrial Revolution, and preferably to keep it below 1.5 degrees. The Paris Agreement represents a legally binding international treaty whereby each nation sets out its own goals and plans for reduction of greenhouse gases. These are called National Determined Contributions, or NDCs. So the Paris Agreement signatories recognised that the NDCs set weren't enough to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and a 5-year cycle was introduced for every nation to renew their NDCs. So this was postponed because of COVID, and is now taking place in Glasgow in November this year. So, and it's called COP26. This is an important date, as decisions made here will literally determine the future of our planet. The UN report, Making Peace with Nature, a scientific blueprint to tackle the climate, biodiversity and pollution emergencies, was released this week. And in the press conference, the UN Secretary General and the Executive Director of the UN Environmental Programme highlighted some of the problems we are facing. Yeah, these are the problems. At the moment, we're not on course for 1.5%. And at the moment, we are on course to be at 3 degrees by the end of this century. And that will be catastrophic if we don't change that. The $4.46 trillion are spent in subsidies worldwide that damages the environment. The world economy has grown 5-fold in the last 5 decades. Millions of species of plants are at the risk of extinction. Disease caused by air pollution kills 6.5 million people each year. 1.8 million are killed by water pollution each year. 1.3 billion are poor and 700 million hungry. Crop production has increased 300% since 1970, and that will partly be because of our growth in population. 10% of forest cover has been lost since 1990, and natural capital declined by 40%. It's a lot of big issues. These are the things that they say needs to be done. So all government should include natural capital in measures of performance. They should all promote the circular economy, shouldn't support agriculture that destroys nature. A price should be put on carbon emissions for businesses, shift subsidies from fossil fuels to low carbon solutions. At the moment, we're seeing very much a mixed. The government's subsidising in some green, but they're still very much subsidising fossil fuels. We need to transform how we view and value nature, reflect nature's true value in our policies, plans and economic systems, investment in policies and activities that protect and restore nature. And we need to see nature as an ally if we're to achieve the SDGs. They say all is not lost. Ambitious and coordinated actions by government, business and people can restore the planet to health. Human initiative, technology and cooperation can transform societies and economies through shifting sectors like energy, water, food, and support for alternative livelihoods and new business models. Economic systems can power the shift to sustainability. All these lead to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is Kate Raworth's donut. There's currently a movement of people, organisations and cities that have taken the donut to heart and changed the way that they do life to take into consideration both people and planet. So the inner circle takes into account a social foundation of well-being that no one should fall below. These are based on the UN Sustainable Goals. The outer circle looks at the ecological ceiling of the planetary pressure, which we shouldn't go beyond. When we don't overshoot the planetary boundaries and don't fall short of the social foundation, we get into the donut. And this is the safe and just place for humanity. And this is what we want for all people. But if we look at the next diagram, this is the reality. We are overshooting on climate change, biodiversity and land conversion, and billions of people aren't getting their most fundamental needs met. I think this is a powerful image in that it brings together two sides of the same coin, social justice and climate and ecological justice. And it shows how globally we need to make changes to tackle these. Creating city portraits is a methodology on the Doughnut Economics Action website that helps cities to downscale and tailor the donut to their own setting and circumstances. So in downscaling the donut, you're invited to look at the city through these four lenses, asking the following questions. What would it mean for the people of this city to thrive? What would it mean for the people for this city to thrive within its natural habitat? What would it mean for this city to respect the well-being of all people worldwide? And what would it mean for this city to respect the health of the whole planet? There are many cities, Amsterdam, California, Cambridge, to name a few, that have adopted the donut to make changes in their city. These donuts can be grassroots up, where lots of volunteers get involved and make things happen. Or they can be more formal and involve local councils. So no two cities are the same, so no two donuts will be the same. I thought about including what other cities are doing. But then I thought maybe attempting to answer these questions for the Cheshire West and Chester area would be more relevant. Quack have declared both poverty and climate and ecological emergencies for our area. So COVID highlighted and exasperated inequalities in our area. Unemployment rose and so did claims for universal credit. Food bank reliance doubled during lockdown. And from an environmental point of view, we are the 4th highest emitter of carbon in the UK because we have big industry. So what can we do as people and organisations? So these are my attempts at downscaling, and these definitely aren't exhausted. And what would you add or change? So what would it mean for the people of Chester to thrive? I've put, because we have declared a poverty emergency and food has been an issue, community allotments, growing food in your own garden, more locally produced food or grown food. I'd seen social supermarkets quite recently, and this seems like a really, really good idea for 2 reasons. The food in the products in these supermarkets comes from the main supermarkets, but it's things that they're ready to throw out. So rather than it going to landfill, it goes to the social supermarket, and then people who are struggling with poverty get to buy the products at a much, much cheaper price. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. So promoting green jobs and training. So we could be retrofitting houses. There's a whole range of green jobs. There'll be lots of jobs coming up in industry specifically to target carbon emissions. A recent meeting I had with councillors, they said industry was very on board trying to tackle those carbon emissions. There's jobs coming up in the energy sector due to the new wind farms and the hydrogen project. One thing I thought we could campaign for in particular is the NHS, and in particular mental health. We've seen massive increases in mental health issues over lockdown, and if the government would provide that funding, that would provide a massive amount to the economy. So other campaigning issues, I put a universal basic income. So it would cost the government 67 billion, but that would virtually eliminate poverty. And as David said earlier, if we can spend 22 billion on a track and trace system that really hasn't been very effective, then surely 67 billion to completely wipe out poverty would be 67 billion well spent. Also, I think a campaign for a free bus for all. People who are struggling financially, getting to interviews would be a problem. So free bus would make a difference. So what would it mean to thrive within its natural habitat? There's lots of really good things going on just now in the Quack area. So I've put on there, we should have some kind of formal protection of natural capital and the commons. I put active travel because there's lots of things on active travel. Use public transport where possible. Growing trees. The Merseyside Forest project is an amazing project. I was watching a talk about it a couple of weeks ago, and the aim of the forest is to go from Cheshire, from Merseyside, all the way over to the east coast. So we'll be planting in our area as well as part of Merseyside Forest. There's the wetlands that are planned at Countess of Cheshire Country Park, and the council have invited people to let them know where they think good areas would be to be rewilded. I think change of land use to increase biodiversity and enable a more sustainable, self-sufficient food supply is really important. And I think that is something that possibly will happen because of changes of rules. And that's something definite to look out for. Campaigning on issues. Again, the free bus for all, because if we had a free bus, more people would choose to use the bus rather than car. I'm not saying everyone will, and I'm not saying it's right for everyone, but a lot more would use the bus. And engage with your local MP, RE COP26, because it's really important that our government stand up, sign up to the highest possible policies to bring us back in line to that 1.5%. So what would it mean to respect the well-being of the people worldwide? Purchase items with a sustainable chain supply. Avoid fast fashion. Fair trade. So we've got Fair Trade Fortnight this week, so that's a good opportunity to just have a look, see what Fair Trade offers. There is Fair Trade products sold at most supermarkets. Sponsor a child. Donate to charities that specifically tackle poverty through sustainable development. Sponsor a village. You might not want to do it yourself, but if you've got a community of people, you could do it. I've heard of churches doing it, but it doesn't have to be a church. Support collaborative commons. This was fairly new to me, but I do think it's great. So basically, the collaborative commons is where information is made available to people rather than trademarking it. So a lot of people in the third world countries might use it because it'll give them the instructions on how to build a solar panel unit so they can power their house rather than cutting down trees to burn. One of the things that I did see, which fascinating, is a potato with metal on each side, and it's used as a conductor to generate electric, like a battery. So I thought that was really interesting. Campaigning on issues. So international aid, especially in light of the UK's budget cut from 0.7 to 0.5% and cut world debt. What would it mean to respect the health of the whole planet? Biggest thing, I think, is making changes to our consumer lifestyles in order that we can prevent the effects of climate change elsewhere. Or if you want to invest, you can invest in solar energy in those poorer countries, donations for sustainable projects, ensuring waste problems in the quack area stay in the quack area and are not sent abroad, and campaigning on issues such as deforestation of the Amazon and using purchase power to make suppliers act ethically. So as David said, I am part of the West Cheshire Green New Deal, and we're currently campaigning for green jobs to help the economy recover from COVID. And also we're working on a free bus campaign to reduce carbon emissions. We're a friendly bunch with a mixed background, and we're always looking for new volunteers. So the link's going in the chat, please get in touch. I will end with this quote by Desmond Tutu, which I think sums up how my thinking has changed over the last year. Bringing people together is what I call Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. Far too often, people think of themselves as just individuals, separated from one another, whereas you are connected and what you do affects the whole world. When you do well, it spreads out. It's for the whole of humanity. So our economics should reflect that we're all connected, all people and the whole of the planet, and what we do affects all. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Well, thank you very, very much, Maria. Absolutely tremendous amount of substance there. I don't really know where to start in lots of ways, but I can actually guarantee almost that everyone who's been listening on this will agree with the vast majority of points that you brought up. And it's quite frightening when you actually look, and I made a note of this somewhere, when you actually look at that slide which you brought up about the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you actually went through those 17, I wonder how many of them in the UK were actually on target for. And the frightening thing, which I think is very few. And I think it's a political will that we come up against, and that's when we bang our head against it, and also big business. We are still getting a situation whereby they want to open a coal mine up in Cumbria. And to me, that's getting government support, and thank goodness the people in Cumbria are standing firm against it at this present moment. But if we go down that route, we're not interested in anything green, we're not interested in anything sustainable, and it just shows that once again, it's for the few and not the many. Now, what I want to do